From 1846 to 1855, Dr. Palmer went on a killing spree that was to become one of the most notorious cases of the time. Born in Rugeley, Staffordshire on August 6, 1824, he was the fifth of 7 children born to Joseph Palmer, a timber merchant, until his untimely death in 1837, and his wife Sarah, who, after her husband's death, would indulge William throughout his life. The family enjoyed a comfortable prosperity, but there were suspicions that Joseph's business had been established through dubious means. It would seem that if the rumours were true, the family on both sides had rather low standards. It was also said that the father was seen as a coarse, vulgar fellow. But above all else, Joseph Palmer was a prudent businessman. He was able to make a significant profit in the area due to its abundance of stately homes who were clearing land for farming and selling the timber. He capitalised on the wealth and resources available. After Joseph's death, it was discovered that he had left behind a substantial amount of money. There was a will, but it hadn't been signed. However, the oldest son, also named Joseph, ensured that the money was distributed fairly among the siblings and their mother. The only condition attached to the inheritance was that the mother should not remarry. Sarah, still being relatively young, entered into a relationship with a man who happened to be quite a lot younger than she. The revelation of these personal details would occur later in court, where it would also come to light that she had engaged in a number of affairs. During that time, such behaviour from a woman was considered shocking and disgraceful. As for William, he was still very young when his father passed, so his inheritance couldn't be touched until he was 21. After his father's passing, young William started to become unruly, as his father had been the one to closely watch over him. But after his death, his mother let the young William run wild, overindulging the child who could do no wrong in her eyes. At grammar school, William, it was later claimed by a former schoolmate, would be caught cheating in exams and got other pupils to do his thesis for him. He apparently didn't pick on the younger boys, but was cruel to animals, and according to his former schoolmate, was very sneaky. When leaving school at 17, he was sent to Liverpool to join his brother, where he started as an apprentice to a wholesale chemist company. After starting well and looking like a conscientious worker, it wasn't long before he was caught embezzling money from the business, when a partner saw him opening the mail on his way back from the mail office. It would come out that he had been taking cash from the envelopes, and cash was missing from customers. His mother repaid the losses, but William was sacked, and to save face and not to bring any disgrace to the family, Thomas Palmer took his brother's place and finished the apprenticeship. William appeared to have developed a fondness for both women and gambling. His preferred form of gambling was horse racing, and he could frequently be found attending races at Liverpool and Chester, spending his ill-gotten gains. So he was sent home in disgrace to be placed in another apprenticeship with a local surgeon as a trainee. It wouldn't take long for the young William to continue his wayward ways. Fees from patients went missing, and frictions with other assistants began. He took up with a local girl who he had been seeing before he left for Liverpool, Jane Widnall, promised marriage and took her father's money, and didn't marry Jane. Jane would eventually marry the surgeon's other assistant and emigrated to Australia with him. William continued to rack up more debts that his family once again paid off, and lost his apprenticeship once again. In 1843 he became a walking pupil at Stafford Infirmary, following and observing doctors doing their rounds. He became fascinated in the narcotic properties in medications, and it's thought that Palmer had been allowed to go through the medications and even take some away with him. It was due to this that the law changed to stop anyone unauthorised taking meds away from the dispensary, and a disliked William was advised to leave. During the 1840s, the hospital system mainly served individuals who did not have a lot of money. Consequently, the quality of care provided was deemed less professional compared to the treatment received by the wealthy class, who were usually attended to within the confines of their own home. Florence Nightingale, rightly so, had a lot to say on the care of those in hospitals, and stated the Hippocratic Oath that hospitals should do the sick no harm, but her ideas on hygiene and administration were thought to be too radical. After a year, Palmer had moved on to St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, where he squandered his money once again. Despite being reasonably attentive in the classroom, he struggled with his studies. Rather than focusing on his academics, he spent a significant amount of his time engaging in activities such as partying, gambling and womanizing. His fellow students saw him as stupidly extravagant. A tutor was hired by Mrs. Palmer, and with his help the young William passed his exams on the 10th of August 1846. He was appointed as house surgeon at St Bartholomew's, but didn't stay long and returned to Rugeley to set up his own practice around the people he knew. Although William was classed as a surgeon, his status as one was of a lower order. William's training was less than some doctors of the time. Those that trained as medical doctors learned such things as botany, midwifery, theology and Latin, whereas William was trained in anatomy and the surgical ways of the time, which was limited. Still, William called himself a doctor and decided he needed to settle down. He reconnected with Annie Brooks, a young woman who happened to be the illegitimate daughter of an Indian Army officer, Colonel Brooks. Annie's father had chosen not to marry her mother, his maid, because he saw her as being in a lower class than himself. He had once loved her. She had been pretty and kind, but over the time he found her harsh and abrasive towards him. The colonel would eventually take his own life. Annie's mother developed a drinking problem and was not only a constant source of embarrassment to her daughter, but also behaved like a tyrant when under the influence of drink. When Anne's father passed, his estate and inheritance was to go to Anne, and his 9 properties went to her mother. And when she would pass, it was assumed the money and the properties would go to Anne. But there was a mistake in the colonel's will, and Anne was placed in chancery, looked after by the courts, under the guardianship of Charles Dawson and Dr. Edward Knight. When marriage was mentioned, Anne's mother was absolutely against it. But William, 23, and Annie, 20, got married on October the 7th, 1847. They decided to settle down in Rugeley, where William began his practice as a doctor. The couple enjoyed a comfortable life in their new home, and William's practice seemed to thrive. In fact, he successfully poached the apothecary from his closest competitor, Thomas Salt, which, unsurprisingly, left Salt feeling disgruntled. William was a regular attender at church and was attentive to the sermons, which stood in stark contrast to his way of living. A year later, Annie gave birth to their first child. They named Will, after his father. Over the next few years, they would have 4 more children. Now, Palmer hadn't really changed his ways. His womanizing and gambling led to numerous rumours regarding illegitimate children and the women he'd had his eye on. The first possible victim of Palmer was in 1846, 27-year-old George Abley, a local glazier, who it was claimed had a wife Palmer had had his eye on. While in the local pub, the Lamb and Flag in Little Wayward, a small village near Rugeley, Palmer challenged the young, thin, sickly man to a drinking contest. Abley refused when Palmer offered him a brandy. Palmer and his friend called Timis teased Abley, betting he couldn't drink a full tumbler of neat brandy. Abley again refused, telling him he wasn't a brandy drinker. When a sum of 15 shillings was offered, he decided to take them up on the bet, He drank the first, and then the stakes were raised for him to do it again. He once again downed the next. A very drunk Abley and the rest of the pub were joyous, and the joke-telling session started. But Abley started to feel ill and went outside for some air. It wasn't until later they realised he hadn't come back. When they found him in the barn, he was on the floor groaning and holding his stomach. He was taken home but passed out later that night. His death was recorded as exhaustion, the result of diseased blood vessels of the lung. It wasn't until years later the inquest jury foreman declared that he believed Palmer had knocked Abley off because he fancied his chances with his wife. Then there was Mary Thornton, Annie's mother, who really didn't like her son-in-law at all. Her addiction to drink and her anger towards Palmer could be seen by anyone, as she didn't shy away from calling him names in front of people. She did, however, give him money when he asked, because, she claimed, she was scared of him. When she was asked to move in with the family, she responded with the statement that if she did, she wouldn't be alive for long. And she wasn't wrong. Just after Christmas 1848, 50-year-old Mary Thornton moved in with her daughter and son-in-law. Within weeks she was found outside the home delirious. 12 days later she passed away in bed. It was widely believed that Palmer would be able to access the properties and finances that he was confident would be given to his wife. However, instead of going to his wife, the properties ended up going to the nearest relative of Annie's father. This was because Annie's parents were not married, which meant that the inheritance did not pass down to Annie. But by order of the Chancery, the properties went to her father's relative. These two deaths were never seen as suspicious, and to be fair, we can only look at these two as rumours. But Palmer's love of racing and gambling became more of an addiction that would lead him to taking more lives. Leonard Bladen worked for a brewery in London, but had been off work due to an injury he sustained when a dray backed into him. His love of racing led him to take the long journey to Chester for the races in the spring of 1850. Bladen visited the races with the good Dr. Palmer, who had offered him a short stay with his family before he was to go home. Bladen had been successful with his bets and apparently won quite a lot of money, at least £500. But Palmer didn't do so well, and at the end of the day, Palmer owed Bladen a substantial amount of money. They returned to Palmer's home with the promise of some pastime pursuits of shooting and possibly the promise of getting his loan back. The next day, Bladen decided to go on a visit to his brothers at Ashby-de-la-Zouch. On his return to the Palmers, he fell very ill and took to his bed. He went downhill quickly. Doctors Palmer, Thirlby and Bamford attended him, Palmer being the one in constant attendance, taking in food, fluids and medication. Mrs. Bladen was ignorant to her husband's illness, and it wasn't until someone they knew had called into the Palmers to see Bladen on his way back from Chester races that she found out he was ill. By the time she arrived to see him, he didn't recognise her. She was removed from the room and didn't see her husband again. He died a little while later and was buried hastily. Before Bladen stayed with him, he had contacted his wife to tell her he had won £500, and with the money that Palmer owed him, he'd be going home with about £1,000. But when widow Bladen counted his money, she found just £15. When she inquired where her husband's money and betting book was, including the £600 Palmer owed, Palmer insisted that it was her husband who owed him £60, claiming Bladen had gambled heavily that day and must have lost most of it. Palmer told her he wouldn't enforce the debt, and so as not to cause a scene, she thanked them for caring for her husband and left. But she knew Palmer had lied, about not taking any money from her husband, as she'd seen the letter signed by Palmer regarding £100 her husband had lent him. She put the matter into the hands of the brewery for investigation, but it would seem no investigation was carried out, and Mrs. Bladen had no other suspicions about her husband's passing. Bladen's body wouldn't be exhumed later as part of the inquiry. More deaths surrounded the Palmer family. Their next child, Elizabeth, passed at just 10 weeks old. Then a year later, Henry, 1 month old. 11 months later, baby Frank passed at just 7 hours old. The last baby, John, lasted 4 days. Only their oldest son, Will, survived. All the records show they passed from convulsions. It was said that the child's nurse, Matilda Bradshaw, after the passing of the last child, ran to the pub next door. She was distraught and cried out that she would never enter that house again. Her employers had done away with another child. She went on to claim that the doctor had insisted on taking over from the nurse, and as she went down the stairs, she heard a terrible cry from the child. The next she knew, the child had died. She would later claim that the doctor would dip his finger into poison, then sugar and honey, and feed it to the baby. When questioned on this, she had to admit she had not actually seen this herself, but it's what she believed had happened. It wasn't reported to any authority of the day. Annie may or may not have had her suspicions about her husband, but she would stay with him to her downfall. In 1854, Palmer insured his wife through different insurance companies, totaling £13,000, which for the time was extremely high. In fact, he had tried for around £15,000 but was denied. That same year, some months after the last baby had passed, Annie went to visit her sister-in-law for a few days. On her way home, she developed a chill. When she returned home, she took to her bed. The next day, Palmer took his wife a sweet tea without milk and some dry toast. Not long after, Annie was violently sick. 4 days later, the aged Dr. Bamford visited and prescribed medication for his diagnosis of English cholera, now called dysentery. Annie's guardian, the elderly Dr. Edward Knight, also visited. Annie was going downhill fast, with Palmer prescribing and administering medication and fluids, one being effervescing sparkling water, something William gave her on a regular basis according to the nurse, and prussic acid, which taken in large quantities can be lethal, but back then it was believed to stop vomiting. But even so, Annie Palmer passed away on the following Friday, the 29th of September 1854. After Anne passed, he took his son to Mrs. Salt, stating that it was his wife's desire that she would take care of their son. Although it was said he was inconsolable, it didn't take him long to take to the maid's bed and get her pregnant. Although it was confirmed Eliza, the maid, had given birth to a son 9 months after Mrs. Palmer had passed, the father's name wasn't put on the record, but it would be later confirmed in a statement that Palmer was the father of her son. Rumours were rife among the people of Rugeley. There had been a lot of deaths surrounding the family, and poison came to many people's mind. It was also discovered he had been corresponding and liaising with a mystery woman called Jane, who may have also become pregnant by William. It's thought William possibly arranged for a termination, according to some letters that were discovered. William had instructed Jane to burn their correspondence, but she obviously didn't, and after a while she became seemingly disheartened by William and began asking for money in return for the letters. Palmer sent a sum of money, but it seems apparent he did not get the letters. Now he had the insurance money payout from Anne's death, some of his gambling debts could be paid off. Walter Palmer, William's older brother, was also a gambler, an alcoholic and a bankrupt, who also suffered from bouts of delirium. Because of the situation, his wife had left him and moved back with her sister, but she remained on good terms with her husband. William asked Walter if he could insure his life and offered to pay him a sum of £400, of which Walter really needed, so he accepted it, but didn't receive it. Walter had been moved into a different home with Tom Walkenden, who was paid 30 shillings a week to care for Walter. Walkenden said he had tried to help Walter by restricting his intake of alcohol, but over 5 months Walter still managed to get through 19 gallons of spirits. In August, Walter went to visit his wife in Liverpool and spent 5 apparently sober days with her. When he left, he went to Rugeley to spend the day with his brother William. On Sunday the 12th of August, William was with Walter at home with Mr. Walkenden in Stafford. Walter was intoxicated and, according to William, he wasn't fit to be seen. Dr. Day had tried to visit on that day, but couldn't get past William. The next day, Monday, William went to the races at Wolverhampton. On the Tuesday, Walter and Walkenden met William at the races, where it was said Walter got very drunk. On William's return to Stafford on the Tuesday the 14th of August, he stopped at a chemist to buy prussic acid and some other items. William denied this claim, but the runner, or boots as they were called, of the Junction Hotel Stafford, who knew William very well, said that on this day Palmer handed him some bottles wrapped in paper and told him not to open them, but to hold on to them until he came back for them. He came back that same day to collect the bottles, and an hour later he brought them back, asking him once again to hold on to them for him. The runner then claimed William asked for them the next morning on the Wednesday. The runner took them down to the stables where Palmer was waiting. When he received them, he took one of the bottles and poured some liquid from a smaller bottle into the bigger bottle. He then poured it back into the smaller one. This was also witnessed by a Mr. Lloyd, who was the landlord, who just happened to walk in. Palmer gave the bottles back to the runner for him to look after. Palmer had a conversation with Mr. Lloyd and told him that his brother was very ill, but he hoped his mixture would help him, and that he found it sad that his brother was drinking himself to death. To which the landlord found this odd, as Palmer had bought a bottle of brandy for his brother just the week before, and told him that if his brother wanted more, to let him have it, and William would pay for it. So to sum up those few days, when Walter returned home from the races on the Tuesday, he was still drunk, but Walkenden kept him supplied with more spirits, so unsurprisingly he was still drunk on the Wednesday. Mr. Day called to see him, but William told him he was still at the races. Walkenden later admitted William had lied, as Walter was still at home. Now William went home to Rugeley on the 15th, and the next day claimed to be going to Ludlow races. He didn't. He went to Walter's home, where he heard from a close friend, Jeremiah Smith, that William's horse was likely to win the Ludlow Stakes. The message came at 2:32 p.m. on the 16th, the same time Walter Palmer passed away, with William and Walkenden by his side. Shortly after Walter's death, William went to find a runner at the Junction Hotel for him to take a message to the train station and have a telegraph sent out to put a £50 bet on a horse at Ludlow. Walter Palmer was buried within 4 days of dying. His recorded cause of death was general visceral disease and apoplexy. William had insured his brother. He had tried for the whopping sum of £82,000. He went to many insurance companies, but was advised to lower the amount. After being advised that a sum of around £13,000 to £14,000 might be possible, he left it in the hands of the London money-lending solicitor Thomas Pratt, who secured another commission with the Prince of Wales Insurance Company. Pratt would later claim at the trial that William Palmer had ruined his life with his irresponsibility with money. In June 1855, William tried again with another company for an extra $10,000 and soon learned some companies would only cover Walter if he lived past 5 years, to which William replied that that wouldn't do for him. But William did manage to secure some insurance, and the Prince of Wales Company spread the risk among 20 other companies. Going back, while William was doing all this, Walter had carried on his daily life. While out walking one day, he met with his doctor, Dr. Waddell. During their meeting, Dr. Waddell informed Walter that he could improve his condition if he would just simply heed his advice and accept his assistance. However, Walter remained unwilling to listen, insisting that his brother William would be the one to help him by giving him some pills. The doctor wouldn't see Walter again and was shocked to hear of his death. Moving forward again, when William went to claim on the insurance, it was questioned and stopped because it was said that it was to cover a £400 loan Mrs. Palmer, the mother, had loaned to the deceased. Walter only received 60 of it, but it was discovered that it was William who took the loan, forging his mother's signature. After a lot of debating, the bulk of Walter's estate went to his wife and Walter's mother. A desperate William wrote to Mrs. Walter Palmer asking for her to pay off Walter's loans, but she refused, telling him Walter had never given her any money and she knew nothing about any debts, so she wasn't responsible for them. Palmer's son with the maid Eliza, 5-month-old Alfred, died 3 months later. But it's not thought he was a victim of Palmer, his cause of death being put down to a viral infection. William Palmer found himself in a dire predicament, burdened by exorbitant debts. Despite owning racehorses, they consistently underperformed and added to his troubles. Compounding matters, his gambling habit had spiralled out of control. He had already handed over his medical practice to his chemist, Ben Thilby, in order to focus solely on his equine ventures, and Thomas Pratt's threats to retrieve his money made him even more desperate, not to mention other moneylenders like Henry Padwick. In November 1855, William went with his friend John Parsons Cook to the races for the Shrewsbury Handicap Stakes between the 13th and 15th of November. William lost heavily, but Cook won big on his own horse, Polestar. The pair had celebratory drinks at the local pub, and by the 14th Cook complained that his gin burnt his throat. William had laughed this off, telling everyone around that there was nothing wrong with the gin. Cook left. When he returned, Cook mentioned to his friend that he had been violently sick and commented that he believed Palmer had been dosing him all along. At this, he decided to hand over his money to his trusted friend. He was again violently sick to the point he had to be taken to bed. He was sick throughout the night, but eventually went to sleep. The next day, Cook confided in a friend that he believed Palmer had poisoned him. His friend responded that if that is so, he should go to the authorities. But Cook gave an odd response that he, his friend, didn't know everything. Oddly, Palmer and Cook remained as friends, and on the 15th, Palmer and Cook returned to Rugeley. Cook, still sick, booked a room at the Talbot Arms. On the 17th, Cook was feeling better and met with Palmer for a drink of gin and dinner, after which he once again became violently sick. Palmer sent over some broth for Cook, after which he once again threw up. The broth had been warmed up at Palmer's house, and while the chambermaid went to get a pot, the broth had gone when she had returned. Palmer walked into the kitchen with the broth and instructed her to take it to the Talbot Arms and tell them that it had been sent by Jerry Smith. Not suspicious at all. Palmer attended Cook throughout the day, and 82-year-old Dr. Bamford also attended on 2 occasions. On the Sunday, more broth was sent and more sickness followed. This time, the chambermaid had also tried some, and she became sick straight away, vomiting for most of the night. Cook seemed to get a little better the next day, the 18th, and Palmer went off to London to collect bets, supposedly on Cook's behalf, to the sum of £1,200. He wasn't altogether successful, and on returning to Rugeley, he then purchased 3 grains of strychnine from the surgery of Dr. Salt. It would be claimed at trial that Palmer put the grains into 2 ammonia pills, then gave them to Cook. Cook screamed and writhed in agony throughout the night, and Palmer was called out to see him. Dr. Bamford was also called out, as was a Mr. J.W. Jones, to look after the sick friend. Pills were once again given, but the vomiting continued. Mr. Jones stayed in the room with his friend. After a short time, Cook cried out to his friend to fetch for the doctor. Palmer arrived with more pills. Vomiting continued. On the 21st of November, about 1 a.m, Cook screamed in agony that he couldn't breathe before passing away. On Cook's passing, Palmer went ahead trying to acquire the rest of his possessions. Having obtained some of Cook's winnings from Shrewsbury, he informed Pratt about his desire to purchase the horse Polestar. He specifically instructed Pratt not to disclose any information if questioned about Cook's money. He arranged for Cook's body to be laid out and was caught going through all of Cook's pockets and searching the room. But Palmer was in for a bit of a shock. Cook's relatives were informed of his death, to which Palmer shouted out, "What? For God's sake, he hasn't got any." So on November the 23rd, a Mr. William Stevens, the stepfather of Cook, arrived to represent the family. Palmer informed him that the deceased had lost his betting books, which he claimed were now useless as all bets were cancelled upon the gambler's death. Palmer also disclosed to Stevens that Cook had signed a letter stating that he owed £4,000 in outstanding bills, and Palmer had a right to claim it from Cook's estate. Palmer managed to obtain a death certificate from the elderly Dr. Bamford, who gave the cause of death of apoplexy. William Stevens asked for an inquest, and it was granted. On November the 26th, a post-mortem on Cook was held at the Talbot Arms. This alone turned into a bit of a farce. The post-mortem was carried out by medical student Charles Devonshire and assistant Charles Newton, and overseen by Dr. Harland and others. The assistant Newton was drunk and stumbling. Palmer happened to bump into him and took the jar of stomach contents from him, claiming it was for safe keeping. The contents were then sent to a toxicologist, Mr. Alfred Swain Taylor, who, when receiving them, said the contents were of very poor quality and he couldn't do anything with them. So another post-mortem took place on the 29th of November. When the results were being sent back to Mr. Stevens' solicitor, Palmer had asked the postmaster, Sam Cheshire, to intercept the letter and let him know what the results were. Cheshire went to Palmer's house on the morning a letter had arrived from London. After he had, in his words, glanced at the open letter and saw the words, "Cause of death," and he told him they had not found any poison, but had noted the word strychnine. Cheshire would lose his job and go to prison for 2 years for tampering with the mail. The toxicologist couldn't find any evidence of poison in his examination, but he stated he still believed Cook had been poisoned. He stated that the explicit details of how Cook had died proved that tetanus was a cause of death produced by strychnine. On December the 15th at the inquest, it was determined by the jury that the deceased had died of poison willfully administered to him by William Palmer. Palmer was arrested on Sunday the 16th of December 1855 for murder and forgery after the moneylender Pratt had accused Palmer of forging his mother's signature on financial documents. He was taken to Stafford Prison, where his clothes were taken from him to be examined for any traces of powder, but nothing was found. Weeks later, in protest of his treatment, he went on a hunger strike and refused to wear the prison clothes. It wasn't until the prison governor told him they would have to force-feed him through a tube that he relented. While Palmer sat in prison, rumours began to spread about all the other deaths that surrounded him. Acting on these rumours, 2 days before Christmas, the graves of Annie and Walter Palmer were dug up and their bodies exhumed. A post-mortem examination was conducted on the bodies at another inn that was also known as the Talbot. The coffins were brought into the meeting room where Ward, the coroner, and 23 locals were present. As soon as the coffins were opened, the odour compelled some of the individuals to hastily leave the room for some fresh air. After the examination was concluded, the samples were sent to Taylor for analysis. On Walter's post-mortem, he had to conclude that he could find no poison, but he still felt confident Walter had died from prussic acid, but had to agree that Walter had died from apoplexy. But the jury ignored this and brought back a verdict of willful murder, but the grand jury overturned this. On Annie, Eliza Tharn, the maid, and Sarah Palmer, William's sister-in-law, gave evidence of Annie's illness. They told of her constant vomiting and slow decline. They gave details telling how William had been very attentive to Annie and even had Dr. Knight, Annie's guardian, give a second opinion. Then Taylor's report was read. He concluded that he had tested all of Annie's organs, stomach, liver and kidneys, and found antimony in all of them. That was given over a short time before death. He stated that it was a build-up over time, not given all at once, stating that it, and only it, must have been the cause of death. The elderly Dr. Knight also changed his mind, claiming he believed she had been poisoned, and it wasn't English cholera, as he had first thought. The jury took 20 minutes to give a verdict of guilty of willful murder. In January, the moneylender Henry Padwick took William's mother to court to recover an outstanding debt, a debt that William had taken out and forged his mother's signature. He was taken to Westminster as a witness. At the court, Mrs. Palmer denied the signature was hers, as did other witnesses. When William was asked who had forged his mother's signature, he replied that it was Anne Palmer, his deceased wife. This couldn't be proven, so the case was dismissed. All Palmer's assets had to be sold to pay for his defence and pay towards the debts he owed. Gone went his 17 racehorses for 4,000 guineas, which is about 4,200 today. All the household furniture was sold, as was any wine found in the cellar. Before Palmer went to court, the newspapers did their thing, giving as much detail as they could in their own distinctive manner, staying as close to the facts as possible, but adding the embellishments needed to sell their papers. The people became gripped to the story, including, it was claimed, the Queen. To be fair, it had everything a sensational story needs: a professional man, poisoning, family deaths, money, and an array of different women. After the stories were delved into and spread around the country, most people had already made up their minds about William Palmer's guilt. On Wednesday the 14th of May 1856, 5 months after his arrest, William Palmer went to trial at the Old Bailey, London. The judges were Lord Chief Justice Campbell, Baron Anderson and Cresswell. Mr. Attorney General Sir Alexander Cockburn, Mr. Edwin James QC, Mr. Bodkin, Mr. Wellesby and Mr. Huddleston conducted the prosecution. Mr. Sergeant Shee, Mr. Grove QC, Mr. Gray and Mr. Keneally conducted the defence. The trial was to last 12 days, which was unusual back then. The prosecution had to lean heavily on their chief witness, toxicologist Taylor's expert evidence, as they knew their evidence was purely based on circumstantial evidence with the absence of poison in Cook's body. Palmer wasn't witnessed by anyone giving him any poison, and 2 doctors had witnessed the death certificate. When it came to the thoughts on strychnine, it was difficult to pinpoint, as this was a relatively new poison and they were limited to its effects and how long it would stay in the system or in what way it would stay in the organs, and nobody at that time had been convicted of murder using this poison. But Palmer had obtained strychnine. When he returned on the Monday evening from London, after collecting payouts on Cook's winnings, he purchased strychnia from Mr. Newton, the pharmacist assistant, and another pharmacist, Hawkins, testified that Palmer purchased further strychnia on the 20th. Palmer, Jones, remained with Cook until his death on the 21st, and the prosecution alleged that Palmer had tampered with the pills prescribed by Bamford, substituting pills containing strychnia, and that these pills killed Cook. It didn't help that Palmer had asked the assistant at the post-mortem to find a way of interfering with the jars the remains were being transported in on the way to Taylor. On Monday the 19th of May, Taylor sat in the witness box to give his expert analysis on his findings. After giving his medical evidence on strychnine and the tests he'd carried out, he was in no doubt that the amount that was given had been absorbed into the stomach, and that was why he couldn't find any trace. Professor Robert Christiansen of Edinburgh University also took to the witness box and corroborated Taylor's findings, stating that the symptoms exhibited by the deceased were only attributable to strychnia. If the quantities were small, he expected there to be no trace after death, he said. The Inspector of Police at Rugeley found a book during the sale of the items from Palmer's home. When prosecutor John Boycott examined the book, he stated, "I believe the handwriting in this book to be Mr. Palmer's, and also in this other book." He read the written note on the front pages. Strychnia kills by causing tetanic fixing of the respiratory muscles. Other books were found that uncovered the effects of strychnine. The defence claimed that Cook and Palmer had an arrangement that Cook would help Palmer with his debts to dispel the money being a motive to kill. They attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's contention that Cook had been poisoned by strychnia. They brought in their own expert evidence that Cook had been in poor health, that the disease, not poisoning, might have led to his demise, and that his death had therefore likely been from natural causes. The key to the defence case was to establish that some agent other than strychnine might have caused Cook's death, and if possible, that strychnine had not been the cause. After an astonishing 12 days of 8 hours a day, both sides rested. In Lord Campbell's summation, he invites the jury to make their own diagnosis and proceeds to do so himself in summarising the evidence presented. The case was sent to the jury and they returned in 1 hour and 18 minutes with a guilty verdict, after which Palmer was sentenced to death. Apart from the public notoriety this case generated, the fact that a special legislation had been required to move the trial to London and a considerable number of medical and scientific experts testified during the course of the trial. The Palmer case turned on medical expertise, since it was their testimony alone that could prove whether the victim had been poisoned or had died of natural causes. Both the prosecution and the defence called over a dozen witnesses, including well-known members of the English and Scottish scientific community, as well as medical practitioners. It thought around 30,000 people were at Stafford Prison on the 14th of June 1856 to see Palmer's public execution by hanging at the hands of George Smith, better known as Throttler Smith. As he stepped onto the gallows, Palmer is said to have looked at the trapdoor and exclaimed, "Are you sure this is safe?" William Palmer was buried beside the prison chapel. Thank you for listening.